Hello Floss Tube, my name is Laura and I am the Nerdy Needle. I'm so glad you decided to join me here on my continuing Floss Tube adventure. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe this video. I'd really appreciate it. I get a kick out of reading all of the questions and comments that I get from fellow Stitchers. It's been really fun having some conversations both in the YouTube box, in the description box, and also on the forum on my website. If you'd like to check out my website, the address is available in the description box below. It's got a Stitcher's dictionary and all the information with regard to this 10 video series that I'm working on, Intro to Cross Stitch 101, 102, and 103. All of the information is compiled there on my website. Today is video number 2 out of my three video series, Introduction to Cross Stitch 102, which is all about stitching tapestry style projects on Aida. So that would include things like Mirabilia, Heaven and Earth Design, Scarlet Quince, Dimensions Gold Collection, Vervaco, and other similar types of projects. This is the type of stitching that I am the most comfortable with. It's what I consider my comfort stitching, is stitching full coverage. And I've developed a really good technique for stitching on the diagonal and doing a parking method, a thread parking method, where instead of pulling the needle off of the thread every time I change color, I'm able to leave all of my threads on needles organized on needle minders in a specific way that keeps them from getting tangled and makes it very easy to switch from one color to another. Today I'm going to show you what are some things that you can use to set up your project. So that will include how to find the 4 corners of your project on your fabric by measuring instead of having to count all of those stitches, how to grade your fabric with Sulky Sliver if you're stitching a not full coverage project, or how you can use easy count fabric if you're stitching full coverage. I'll show you a couple of scroll frames that I really like and how I set up my scroll frames in a specific way. I'll talk about what you can do to increase your floss coverage. That's something that's really important in tapestry style stitching. You only want to see your stitches. You don't want to see the fabric between your stitches. So what are the things you can do to get your stitches to cover the fabric better? I'll also show you how you can do a test stitch. The style of stitching I'm going to be showing you is row by row or column by column, starting in a corner. But there's 4 corners to a project, and I'm going to show you how you can determine which corner works the best for you, which one you prefer, and also whether you prefer stitching rows or columns. So we'll do a little test stitch activity, which will help you figure that out for yourself. And then finally, I'll talk about the GoodReader app, which is what I use for my charts. I digitize my charts by just taking photos of them, and then I import them into GoodReader, where I can turn them into a PDF, and there I can mark off all of my stitches. I can put in annotations. I can do all sorts of stuff on my chart, including drawing in diagonal lines, because I like to stitch on the diagonal, and that's one of the things that I'm going to be showing you how to do. So these are all the things I'm going to be talking about today. In the video number 3, I'll actually sit down and show you the actual needle parking method on the diagonal, step by step, in how I do that. But this information I think is valuable to have an idea of how you want to set up your project and what are the things that you would like to try. Now, speaking of trying, I'm going to talk about a bunch of different techniques, and I would love to hear your thoughts on which technique you find the most interesting, which one you would like to try. Please leave a note in the description box below. I'd like to find out what all people are thinking out there in FlossTube land. So let's get started with talking about how to find the 4 corners of your project on your piece of fabric by measuring it. The first thing that you'll need to do is to wash and iron your fabric to get all the creases out. So just soak it in water and then iron it dry. Just watch the heat. I have managed to scorch a piece of Aida once because I got a little too exuberant with the heat. Next, I'm going to show you how you can find all 4 corners of your project on the fabric by measuring it. You could count it, but on a larger projects, that's hundreds of stitches of counting, and who wants to do that when you can use a tape measure to measure it instead? So I've made a worksheet because I'm a teacher and worksheets are how I roll. So let's take a look at the worksheet that I've made. So this worksheet, all of my worksheets are available as PDFs in the description box and then also on my website. I've given you thorough directions for how to do everything. So the first thing you're going to do to calculate your needed measurements is to fold your fabric into quarters because we're going to be measuring from the center. And Aida is a very stiff fabric, so you can just finger press it and it'll hold the crease just fine. So next we're going to figure out how far we need to measure to find all 4 of the corners, and then we're going to mark those corners with the tailor's tack. So the pattern that I'm stitching is from Laurel Birch. And so you're going to need some dimensions from your project. I have set these worksheets up to be the absolute start of the calculation. Now, a lot of times your patterns or the packaging of a kit will have more information on it, and so you'll be able to skip some of these steps. But I want to start from the absolute beginning. If you have nothing except for a piece of fabric and the chart, then you can figure out how big your pattern is going to be using the process I'm about to explain to you. So if you're just looking at a chart and you don't have the stitch count, you can figure out how many stitches wide and high and tall the pattern is just by adding up your blocks of 10, and you can figure out your stitch counts that way. My project tells me my stitch counts. So it's 80 stitches wide and 108 stitches high. It needs to be divided by the fabric count. Now, my pattern tells me that this is 14 count. And once I get done with all of this, I'll show you how you can actually do a test stitch on fabric to figure out what the count is on the fabric. So we need to divide 80 divided by 14, and that's 5.7, and 108 divided by 14, that's 7.7. Just transfer those two numbers down. And yeah, this information was on my chart, but again, I want to start with the absolute basics and show you how you can get to these numbers if this isn't provided for you. Now, these dimensions are for the full width and the full height of your pattern, but we want to measure from the center of the pattern, so we're going to divide both of those numbers by 2. So we get 3.9 and 5.7 divided by 2 is 2.9. So not quite 3, not quite 4. Those are our dimensions. Now, when you do this by measuring, you're not going to get to the exact stitch. So you're going to be plus or minus a few stitches left or right, top or up or down. But because all projects have quite a generous margin around it, if your pattern ends up shifted over or shifted up or down, it really doesn't matter because it's going to get framed in the end anyway. So it's not something you need to worry about. So we need to measure 2.9 inches. I need to put my glasses on. So we're going to measure not quite 3 inches. And I'm just going to put a marking pin, and I'm just going to just stick it through the fabric, but just lay it like that. So that's going to be my measuring spot. And then I need to go not quite 4 up. And you can use the Aida as a straight edge. You can see the lines, or the holes as they line up. And then I'm just going to put a tailor's tack right there. So to make a tailor's tack, all you do is you come through one square horizontally, and then you just loop through again, trying to avoid pulling your tail through, which I think I just did. Yep, it's the only hard thing about making tailor's tacks, is making sure you hang on to that tail so that it doesn't pull through. And these are just a really great little tool I learned from Jean Farish. It's a great way to mark your fabric. It's really easy to take them out, and so it's just a great way of leaving yourself markers. So then I need to come down the same, not quite 3, using the... Now if you get off a little bit by like 1 square over or up or something, even marking this with a tailor's tack, this is just an approximation, really. So this doesn't have to be precise to the exact stitch. I just lost my spot. Come on. So these are just kind of like waypoints, but they're not... If you're off by a stitch or 2, left or right, up or down, it doesn't matter, because you're really only going to use one of these corners to begin your stitching. Didn't pull it through this time, yay. So there's 2 of those. I'll do the other 2 and I'll come back to you. So marking your 4 corners in this manner is a really good idea, because it makes sure that you're going to have enough fabric for the pattern that you want to stitch. I have run into that before, where I ordered a pattern from 123 Stitch. It was a Country Cottage Needleworks, and I ordered all of the floss and the fabric that was recommended or that's needed for the project. If you've ever been on 123 Stitch, you know, off on the side they tell you what are all the needed floss and fabric for that particular pattern. And I just ordered it based on what they were telling me, and I was about 15-20 minutes into stitching the project, and I was looking at it and I thought, there's something wrong here. And so I went and measured it again and measured it again, and realized that there wasn't enough fabric for the pattern that I was just beginning to stitch. So fortunately I didn't lose hardly any time with it, but it was just another wake-up call that double checking, triple checking to make sure that your fabric is big enough for the pattern that you're going to stitch is incredibly important, because to my knowledge I don't know if there is a solution for a partially stitched pattern where you discover that there's not enough fabric. I don't know if there's a way that you can attach more fabric to the piece that you have. I don't want to find out, and so I'm very careful with making sure that I have enough fabric. So with regard to that, if you're uncertain about the thread count of your fabric, there's a very easy thing that you can do to determine that. So what you do is, and I've given you instructions for how to do that here also. Since most fabric is 14, 16, or 18 count, or double that if you're stitching on linen, all you do is you stitch 18 stitches, and then you measure it with a tape measure to find out how many stitches there are in an inch, because fabric count is just stitches per inch. So you line it up and you count it, and for example this is exactly 18 stitches, because that's what I always count out, and so this is 18 count fabric. I did it here too, and you can immediately see that these result in larger stitches, so this is the lower count fabric, and when I add all of those up, when I count up all the stitches, this comes out to 14 count. I actually have done this. I did it on a piece of linen. This is a project I'm currently stitching on, and you can see that I did a test stitch here, and when I measured it, this came out to 30 count, so stitched over 2, it's 15 count. So that again is a way to double check if you have a piece of mystery linen. It's not a complete loss, and you don't have to give yourself monster borders to make sure that you'll have enough fabric. You can just do a quick stitch test and measure it, and then you'll know what your count is. So from everything on this worksheet, you have enough information to be able to figure out how big of a piece of fabric you need with a piece of mystery fabric where you don't know the count, and just a chart with no other information. With those two things, you can figure out how big your project is going to be on that piece of fabric, and you can make sure that it's going to actually fit onto that fabric. So that's how you measure your 4 corners and how you do all of this math. The next thing I'd like to talk about is gridding fabric. Why you would do that, how you would do it, and how it all works. So I've been gridding all of my fabric for tapestry style projects. So that would be full coverage or almost full coverage patterns. I find it incredibly helpful in my counting. I really don't like doing a whole lot of counting, so anything that can reduce down the amount of that I need to do is a good thing. And what gridding does is it gives you guidelines so that you can easily find your spot on your pattern and the corresponding place on your fabric. And so I've been finding that ever since I've been using gridded fabric, I'm frogging way less, so way less mistakes, way less frogging. I can stitch for days sometimes without frogging more than a stitch or two here or there. And in large part, that's because I use gridded fabric. So there's several ways that you can do this. The first way that's very common, I see it on FlossTube all the time, is using water-soluble markers to draw in a grid. Now, I used to do that for years and years, despite hearing all of the warnings on FlossTube from fellow stitchers telling me, oh, be careful, because one of these days your grid lines aren't going to disappear. And I ignored them. I said, oh, that will never happen to me. And I was stitching away and just happily going along until it happened to me. I had a really lovely little project. I only had about a week of work in it, but I finished it. I had gridded it in water-soluble marker. I had finished it, washed it, the lines all disappeared. I took it to the framer, got it back, and the lines had reappeared. So we had to take the frame apart. I brought the project home. I had to soak it for days and days and days to get those lines to finally disappear. It was an unpleasant few days. Luckily, it was a rather small project, so even if it was a loss, it wasn't like I had a huge amount of work in it. But boy, was it a wake-up call for me. I will never, ever grid with a water-soluble marker again. It's just not worth the risk. I was so angry with myself. I was saying really mean things to myself in 2 languages about my own stupidity of why didn't I listen to all of those more experienced stitchers who were telling me that this is a bad idea. So I'm telling you, this is a bad idea. There are other ways that you can grid your fabric. Yes, it takes a little bit longer, but you know with 100% certainty that those grid lines will disappear and you will not have any kind of heartache at the end of your project. So stay away from water-soluble markers unless they're completely covered in stitches, and then they're fine. But putting water-soluble marker on fabric that will remain uncovered, I think is a really bad idea. So what are the other options? Well, if you're going to stitch full coverage, then I would recommend just replacing your fabric with easy count pre-gridded fabric. Now, I would only use pre-gridded fabric for full coverage because I have used it and it worked beautifully, and it was a full coverage, but when I washed it, the grid lines faded, but they didn't completely disappear. I didn't try particularly hard because I didn't care, because the fabric is going to be under the mat and the frame, so it doesn't matter to me. But based on that experience, I won't use pre-gridded fabric on anything except for full coverage. And if it's a full coverage piece, then I'm automatically going to switch out to pre-gridded easy count fabric because it's just so convenient. But for less than full coverage, I won't use it. What I do for less than full coverage is I sew in a grid with something called Sulky Sliver. I learned this from a woman on FlossTube, Melissa. I can't remember her last name. I'll put her name up on the screen. She did a great job explaining how to use Sulky Sliver to grid, and I'll show you how that all works. So Sulky Sliver is it's a metallic thread. It's actually some sort of nylon or plastic. It's a flat thread that has a bit of width to it. So it's perfect for gridding because you cannot pierce it with your needle. So once you're done with your project, this will just slide out from underneath your stitches with no trouble at all. You would never want to do what I'm going to show you with embroidery floss or regular thread, because one of the things that happens is as you're stitching along, it's inevitable that you pierce some of those grid lines if it's just regular thread, and getting the grid lines out at the end will be an absolute nightmare if you can even manage to do it. So using something like this that you can't pierce with your thread or with your needle is the way to go. So let's talk about how this works. I'm going to show you what the gridding looks like in the middle of the project, and then I'll talk about what happens on the margins. So the way you grid is you go underneath 2 and then over the top with 8. And then underneath again 2 and then over the top with 8. So that will continue on. The intersection is on the underneath part. 5, 6, 7, 8, and then underneath there. So there's my intersection, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then underneath 2, and there's my intersection, and then up like that. So that's how you grid. Now, when I first started doing this, I was a little bit confused about how to use this until I realized that you shouldn't think of this as 2 plus 8, as 2 plus 8. You should think of it as 1 plus 8 plus 1. So that's your first stitch. This is 2 through 9, and that's your 10th stitch. So once you think about it in that terms of 1 plus 8 plus 1, that's how you get your block of 10. Then it all clicks. So this is stitch number 1 over here, and this would be stitch number 10 over there. Once you have this down, it completely makes sense, and sewing this in is actually pretty quick. So what do you do at the corners or at the top? Because that's where we're going to start gridding. We're going to sew in the perimeter of the pattern, and then we'll fill in the inside bits of the rows and columns on the inside part. So how do you deal with the top and the left edge? Well, if this is my upper left corner of my pattern, there's nothing over here, so I'm not going to grid over here. Same thing here. So what you need to remember is that you're going to go under 1 in the corner, and then go over 8 and go under 2, and then you can do your under 2 over 8 until you get to the other corner. So let's take a look at how this works. So Sulky Sliver is a very, very slippery thread. It doesn't tangle. In fact, the hardest thing to do with it is to to tie a knot in it. So you can cut a really nice long length, something you would never do with cotton thread, because it's just never going to tangle on you. So you're going to need to tie a knot in it, but it's not going to be the only anchor point of your thread. But you do need a knot. So this is how I do it. I wrap around 2 fingers, making a loop, and I'll hold that loop in my other hand. And then I just start rolling it like this, just trying to get that thread to roll through itself over and over and over again. This becomes a little bit easier when you start kinking and damaging the floss. Then it's going to stick to itself more. Once you've got some twists built up, you can draw it down and see if you do have a knot. A lot of times you don't, and you have to do it again, or the knot is too small. So I'm just going to do that one more time. So wrap around 2 fingers, hold with your other finger, with your other hand, and then you just roll it, roll it. You can also just tuck it through to get it started. And most of the time you just get a really ugly knot, but you want it to be kind of big. So that's like a ridiculously ugly knot, but it's reasonably big, so I'm just going to go with that. So now you're going to anchor your Sulky Sliver. So this is another reason why these tailor tacks are great, because now you know exactly where you need to start gridding. And if you're doing a larger piece of fabric, I've just kind of gone on autopilot, and without marking my corners, I would just keep going and going until I got to the edge. So it's nice to have markers to tell you when you can stop, so you're not wasting a bunch of your time. So you're going to anchor under the mat. So you don't want to do your anchoring in any part of the fabric that will be visible in the finished project. So you pull through, and then you're going to just pick up 2 or 3 stitches. That's 3. And you're just going to weave through this several times. So just going back and forth through that hole several times. So now you have 2 anchors. You have the woven bit, and then you have that knot at the end. So you're not putting a whole lot of tension on that knot. And I just lost my tailor's tack. Oh, I can even see the hole where it was. So now I need to go under 1. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to pretend like it's under 2, because I have to go down somewhere anyway. So I'm going to go down there and then come up there. So go down 1 before my little I can see the slightly enlarged hole on that stitch. So I'm just going to go down 1 before it and then 1 after it. So you can see there's 2 stitches under there, which correspond to this right here. And then this is where you got to start counting to 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So at 8, I go down, go under 2, come back up. And I'm using a sewing motion. I don't like to poke and pull this because it's a lot easier to just kind of sew it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Down, skip 2, come back up. Because this thread is so slippery, you don't have to pull through all the way every time. I just kind of just pull the needle back through just barely and then I will pull it through all the way when I get to the end of the row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, down, skip 2 up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, down, skip 2 up. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so I needed 80 stitches, so that's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. Notice that my tailor's tack was off by 1 row, which is fine. Like I said, the tailor's tacks don't have to be spot on. They're more just a marker to show you that, yeah, those are your 4 corners. And then you just pull that, get rid of it. So now we need to talk about how you turn your corner. So we're not going any further because this is now my edge of my pattern. So instead of keep going, I'm just going to go at a diagonal. So I'm going to go under at 1 angle, just down 1 block, and then come up and start doing my 8 and my 2 again. So I actually shouldn't have come up there. So there's my 8 blocks. Now I'll come back to you, but I'm going to recount this because this is something you absolutely have to get right. So I'll be back. Okay, so that is correct. So now I need to turn my corner, and so I'm just going to come up at an angle. So in the nearest hole at the angle. So I come up there, and then that's my first stitch. So this is the first one. So now I need to go 8 and then under 2. So back to that. I've gone all the way around the perimeter now, and so now I need to end my thread. So it's just going to be that same weaving process. So off under the mat, so on a part of the fabric that will not be visible when it's framed. And then I just do the same thing I did to start. So I just weave through a bunch of times. And then once I've done that a few times, I'll just run it under that and put a few knots. And that should be good. So this is the stitching the perimeter is the time and is the part where you actually do have to pay attention to counting. The filling in part is actually not a whole lot of counting you have to do, and I'll show you a few tricks for that. Before we get to that, if you are stitching something that is a not full coverage project, which is really the only time I would use Sulky Sliver, I wouldn't grid something that's going to be full coverage because I would just use easy count for it. For Sulky Sliver, if you have, say, a figure, so let's say that this is my figure that's going to be in the middle of my pattern, and all of this around it is empty fabric. So how would I grid this? Well, I would stitch the perimeter because that's a great way to double check or triple check that you have enough fabric. And then I would use the top margin to count over to where this, where the actual figure starts. So I would count using these blocks of 10 and these blocks of 10, and I would just mark with tailor's tacks right outside where my figure lies. And then I'd just take some long basting stitches to get to that point with my Sulky Sliver. And so I would start gridding right about there. And I would grid to there. So I would actually only do detailed gridding that's slightly bigger than what my figure is going to be in the middle of the fabric. And then I would just use long basting stitches to get my Sulky Sliver from the margins, because again, I'm not going to anchor here because that would be visible. I would anchor off in the margin, which is not going to be visible in the framed project. Anchor, long basting stitch, come up at the block of 10 that is slightly outside of the figure, grid this in detail, go down, and then just grid around this in a smaller rectangle, just using long basting stitches to get my floss there, or to get the Sulky Sliver there. So that's how I would grid for something like a mirabilia. I'll thread another piece and then I'll show you a good way of not really having to count a whole lot. When I start filling in the grid in the middle, I'm going to anchor outside, and I'm going to stitch the long way first, and then I'll fill in the shorter side. So same thing as before, just come up. Boy, did I ever use a long piece of thread for this. And then just weave it through a few times. And then I'm just going to go down. So I'm coming up like that. And then now I can start my 8. So the way that I do this without having to count to 8 all the time is I just lay my needle down where the thread is going to lie, and then I just look down here to make sure that my needle is at the right spot, and that tells me where I need to go down. So I don't have to count this because I just use my needle as a straight edge, and I know that that's where the thread's going to lie, and then this is where I go down and come back up. So you just use your needle as a straight edge. Using a slightly larger needle, I believe this is like a 26. It's just a little bit longer, it might be easier. But that's essentially how you can grid without having to count. Now that you have that perimeter all counted, you can just use that as a reference point for the rest of it. So I'll get all of this done, and then I'll come back to you. I've gotten all of the long way done. This actually goes a lot quicker using that needle as a straight edge method. So now I need to do the shorter side, but since I finished my thread here and I still have a bunch, I don't want to cut this off and start again, but I also don't want to carry this over at an angle. So I'm just going to tunnel it. Let's just make sure I'm in the right corner. Yep. So I'm just going to tuck under that, and then just tuck under so that it's running on the perimeter, so I don't have a big long carried thread that's just going to get stitched over by my pattern. So I'm coming up there, and you can see that I just tunneled around so I'm not carrying across. And now I just have to fill in the rest of this, so I'll be back. I have this whole thing gridded now. One thing I want to point out is that if you make slight mistakes, as long as you have your block of 10 and that's correct, it doesn't really matter. Like right here in these three columns, I'm off by 1 stitch as far as going down and coming up. But I've got my block of 10, and so I don't really care. I'm not going to rip this out just to get that exactly spot on, because I can see where my blocks of 10 are, so it's fine, and I'm just going to leave it. So don't automatically think that it needs to be perfect, and if you make a small mistake, before you start pulling things out, look at it and think, do I have my block of 10? Is it very clear for me? And as long as you have your block of 10 and it's clear where that is, then you really don't need to fix any mistakes. If you do need to pull things out, think about where you're going to cut your thread, because this you can completely re-stitch. So if you need to cut something, think a little bit ahead, see how much of that thread you can salvage and re-stitch, so you don't have to go through the whole anchoring, weaving and doing all of that, making your knot. So save yourself some time and think before you frog. This is my completed full coverage piece that I used Sulky Sliver guideline on. You can see that in a lot of places I stitched underneath this thread. I just loosened this so you could see it. Other places I stitched on top of the Sulky Sliver guideline. It really doesn't matter. This product is completely flat, so it's not going to lift your stitches at all. I did try to stitch underneath it quite a bit, because once you stitch over the top of it, you lose that guideline reference. And so if you're having to count from that position over, then you no longer have that reference line. So that's why, as you see that, I mean, like right here, I stitched over the top of it, but in a lot of places, the guidelines are very clearly still there. So I've started pulling out my guide thread. Here it is. And I'm just using my laying tool. I'm being extremely careful not to accidentally cut any of my threads. So I'm lifting up, and this just comes out like a dream. It's beautiful. Another product that people use for the same type of stitch sewn in grid, and that's essentially monofilament or fishing line. It looks like this. It's called Easy Count Guideline. You can see there's a big mistake in this. That's why I abandoned this project, but I still have it. And I never really liked it. It was actually kind of hard to sew in. Sulky Sliver is way easier to sew in. And this stuff, the thing I really don't like about it is it's all just very pokey. So it's just not a very pleasant substance, this monofilament. So if you're going to sew in a grid, I would choose Sulky Sliver before I would do this. Finally, I wanted to talk about pre-gridded fabric and how it compares to Sulky Sliver. So when you look at Sulky Sliver, you see that it runs in between your stitches, so it will look exactly like your grid lines on your pattern. Easy Count does not. Easy Count is actually is rather thick, so the line is rather thick, and this is actually the first stitch of your block of 10. So Easy Count looks like that. So here's your first stitch, which is under that, and then here's 2 through 10, and then the next grid line is your next first stitch in the next block of 10. So this takes a little bit of getting used to. So the horizontal grid lines will look like this. So that's what your block of 10 will look like. So you just have to remember that the guideline is actually your first stitch. The stitch before the next guideline is the 10th stitch. And once you figure that out, once your eye kind of gets used to it, it's all very straightforward. So that's Easy Count pre-gridded fabric, which I would only use on full coverage patterns. The next thing I'm going to show you is how I set up my scroll frames. I've got two brands that I'm going to show you, and let's take a look at those now. So the first one I'm going to show you is the Tomorrow's Treasure, which works on a Velcro system. So there's the fuzzy side of Velcro on one side of the bar and the hook side on the other. And so you just, it comes with some of the hook side, a roll of this stuff, and you just cut off a strip of it for both the top and the bottom of your piece of fabric. Notice the way that I've set these up. I've got them on opposite sides, and I'll show you why in a sec. So it's quite straightforward. You just stick your Velcro on, and then you just roll up your fabric. And I roll off of the fabric so it kind of winds up on itself inside or on top of the bar. And you just tighten everything down, and you can get your fabric fairly tight with this. If I worked at this, I could get it a bit tighter than that. Notice that I've got this rolled under at the bottom and over at the top. The reason for that is because if I have any stitches that are rolled up onto the bar, they're going to be on the inside because this is the back of the fabric. This is the part of the fabric that I'm going to touch the most. My arms will touch it, my hands will touch it, my clothes will touch it. So this is the place where I really need to protect my stitches that have been completed and are getting rolled up on the bar. On the top bar, that's much less of an issue. Additionally, for rolling it this way, this is a nice little tool tray, and I use that for my scissors and my laying tool. It's really convenient to just have them at hand at all times. On the top bar, I roll the other way because I park threads draped over the back of the bar, and the shorter ones, if this is rolled the other way, the shorter ones have a tendency to flop back into my work, and I found that annoying. So I started rolling it the other way. If I have stitches up here, I'll throw a grime guard on here. So it's just a fabric with some elastic in it that covers this top bar to protect any stitches that are there. But that's how I always roll my scroll frames. So this is the Tomorrow's Treasure. I've had this thing since high school. You can, with a little bit more work than I just put into it, you can get this pretty darn tight. And it's a nice little system. The other frame that I'm going to show you is the Arabesque frame. This thing is phenomenal. I have some emotional attachment to my Tomorrow's Treasure because that was one of my first purchases when I got my first job after college. It was quite the investment for me back then. But honestly, this is the superior frame in my opinion. It was 31 bucks on, excuse me, on Amazon. And the way this works is with this plastic clip system. So there's a little ridge on these clips, and there's a groove in each bar. So you just line up your fabric, and then you just pop these clips on. And even on the ends, I just put the clips on just to keep from losing them. And then for the bottom, again, I'm going to roll it the other way. So I'm going to flip this upside down. And again, just line up your fabric with that groove. And then just pop these clips on. And these clips, there's an arrow on them which shows you which direction to turn them to take them off of the bar. So that's really handy. So tighten the top groove down, tighten the bottom, and this thing you can get your fabric drum tight on it. This thing can get the fabric about as tight as my Millennium frame. So this is a great little product. If I was buying a frame and a stand now, I would get a few different sizes of this so that the stretcher bars are different lengths, or these bars are different lengths for different widths of fabric, and then I would get their floor stand. I think this is a great little product. It's a new company. I've just recently started seeing them, but they do a great job, and this is a really high quality frame, so I highly recommend this. I love my Tomorrow's Treasure, but given the choice, I would go with this. The next thing I'd like to talk about is what you can do to increase the coverage of your floss on your fabric. With tapestry style stitching, getting good coverage is really important. You really don't want to see the fabric between your stitches. You only want to see the stitches. So there's a few strategies that you can use to increase the coverage of your floss. I've seen quite a number of people on FlossTube talk about increasing the number of strands of floss they use from 2 to 3. In my opinion, that's probably not the best solution to the coverage issue. And the reason for that is because one of the things that makes for a pretty stitch is for the strands of floss to lay parallel with each other. So if these are your strands of floss, you want them laying next to each other. You don't want them overlapping. Now, it's hard enough to get that to happen with 2 strands of floss. With 3 strands, where you can have all sorts of overlapping combinations, it's going to be really tricky to consistently get those 3 strands to lay parallel with each other. If you're looking to increase the amount of thread that you're using, I would look to a different type of thread. I've seen a few people talking about using floche, F-L-O-C-H-E. I know nothing about it. All I've seen is just what a few people have been doing. But it is a larger diameter thread, so you're going to get better coverage from that. So if you're looking to just increase the bulk of the floss on your fabric, I would look more towards switching away from 6-stranded floss to something that's got a little bit more heft to it and stitching with that as opposed to going with 3 strands of floss. The 3 methods that I feel give you consistently better coverage are to increase your fabric count, because you're going to make smaller stitches, and so it's easier to cover the fabric as you increase the fabric count. The second way is to use a laying tool, and the third way is to railroad your stitches. So I'll show you how all 3 of those work. For increasing the size of your fabric, I've made another worksheet, and I'll show you how to use it. So here we go. Here's the worksheet that I've made that will help you determine the size of fabric you need if you switch to a different count fabric. I've made one for inches, and I've also made one for centimeters. Both are available as a PDF, both on my website and in the description box below. I've given you detailed directions in how to do this. I'm going to show you the longest calculation. There's a good chance that you're going to be able to stitch ahead depending on what information you have available. This is the pattern that I'm going to be stitching soon. This is on 14 count, and I'd like to bump this up. I've decided to go a little bit crazy, and I'm going to try stitching this on 20 count Aida. So I'll show you how to do this calculation. Now, you might have the stitch count on your pattern or on the packaging, and then you can just skip ahead to the next step. But I actually, on this pattern, I don't have that. I only just have the dimensions, and honestly, I don't want to add up all of those blocks of 10 on the pattern. So I'm just going to go with the size in inches. So this thing is 8 inches by 16 inches. It is on 14 count fabric. And so I'm just going to convert inches to stitch count. So this is 112 stitches by 224. So I just transfer those numbers down here, and I want to stitch this on 20 count. So I just divide by 20, and is 5.6. So that's the dimensions of my project on 20 count. You can see that it's substantially smaller than on 14 count, which makes sense because I'm stitching smaller stitches. Excuse me. So that's just the pattern. Let's add a margin to that. So by convention, most people add 3 inches on all sides. So 5.6 plus 6 is 11.6, and this is 17.2. So I always round up. So I'll round this up to 12, and I'll round that up to 18. So a 12 by 18 size fabric will give me over a 3-inch margin, and it will be plenty big enough for me to stitch this project. When I get this fabric, I'm going to redo this calculation and double check it, and then I'm going to really think about this and make sure that I'm going to start stitching knowing that I have enough fabric and that everything is going to work out fine. But that's how you do your calculation to convert to a different count fabric and to figure out how much fabric you need. There are definite advantages and disadvantages to increasing fabric count. The main advantages include better coverage. Because you're stitching smaller stitches, each stitch has to cover a smaller bit of fabric, and so it's less likely that you're going to be able to see the fabric between your stitches. So your coverage will most definitely increase. The other thing that will increase is your resolution of your pattern. So tapestry style stitching is very similar to the pixels on your computer screen. The smaller the pixels, the better the resolution, the clearer the image, the sharper the edges. The same thing is true with stitching. In our case, our stitches are our pixels, so the smaller you make your pixel, the smaller you make your stitch, the better the resolution is, the smoother the edges become, and the more refined the image that you produce at the end. So those are definitely the advantages of increasing fabric count. The main disadvantages are simply being able to see it. It's a significantly smaller block of Aida. The holes are also smaller, so seeing it is one of the main issues. Now, getting a good pair of magnifiers, like the ones I've been talking about, the Panapo head mount magnifiers, for many people that will solve that problem. It certainly does for me. I use those head mount magnifiers for all of my stitching, and I can stitch on 20 count with no trouble. I just pop in a higher magnification lens and off I go. But I only have a little bit of age-related vision issues. I just need reading glasses. If you have more significant vision issues, then obviously that's something that you're going to have to experiment with to see if it's possible for you to stitch on a higher count fabric. The other thing that you have to consider is that stitching on a smaller blocks of Aida means that you are stitching on a smaller scale. So if you have a bit of a hand tremor, then that again is something you're going to have to try out to see if with that condition you can manage to stitch on a smaller scale. There's absolutely nothing wrong with stitching on lower count fabric, so stitching on 14 count or even 10 or 9 count or whatever. As long as you're stitching and you're enjoying it, that's all that matters. So I'm certainly not denigrating stitching on lower count fabrics. I have plenty of projects that I've stitched on 14 count. I really enjoyed them and they turned out lovely. So there's really nothing wrong with that. I'm certainly not saying that, you know, everyone should stop stitching 14 count and start stitching 20 count or something. That would be ridiculous. Absolutely not. But if you're looking to increase your coverage, then it is something that you should consider, is bumping up. If your kit has 14 count, maybe bump it up to 16 or even 18 count, and see how that works for you. I have a comparison of 2 pieces of Aida, which is the ones that I did that test stitch on that I showed you earlier, but we'll take a look at those again. I want to compare the two so you can see the difference between a 14 count and an 18 count. So let's take a look at that. Here's a comparison of two pieces of Aida. This one's 14 count, this one is 18 count. You can see how much smaller the 18 count fabric makes our stitches than on the 14 count. I'll also show you both of these backlit. I'll take a photograph of them so you can have a comparison of the size of the holes. Now, if you're converting a kit from 14 count to 18 count, that's something that you can safely do. The amount of floss that you're provided is going to be more than enough because your stitches are going to be smaller. You're covering less area of fabric, and so you're going to have floss to spare. If you're going the other way, if you're decreasing the fabric count, so say you're going from a 16 count to a 14 count and you bought a kit, there's some chance that you're going to run out of floss because your stitch sizes are now going to be bigger, and so you're going to use more floss than what the manufacturer of the kit anticipated you would. So that's something that you definitely need to consider. I'm going to show you how to use a laying tool. So what a laying tool does is it forces your two strands of floss to lay parallel to each other. So they'll lay like this as opposed to overlapping. That increases your coverage and it leads to prettier stitches. There are two styles of laying tool. The first one is the pencil style, which is a cylinder that tapers to a point. And then there's the trolley needle, which is one that you wear as a ring. This is the Celtic design one. There's also a minimalist one that's a little bit less expensive than this one. But both do the same thing. They force your strands of floss to lay parallel to each other. So let me show you how this works. So the pencil style one is a little bit, I find it a little bit harder to use because you're having to switch, you're holding it and manipulating the needle at the same time. So I'm just going to pop through that first stitch. So you just, as you're pulling your thread through, if you catch it on the laying tool and you put a little bit of tension on it, so I'm actually resisting the pull of the thread in my bottom hand as it moves through the fabric. And that forces those two strands of floss to lay parallel to each other. So again, you just loop through, and that forces those strands to lay parallel, and then as you get close with your laying tool to the fabric, you just let it slide off the tip and you seat your stitch. Now, one thing on all kinds of stitching, both tapestry style and sampler style, it's important that when you seat your stitch, you think about it as seating a stitch. So you're not jerking on it. You don't want to expand out the hole. So you don't want to put too much tension on your thread. It's important that you be consistent in your tension. But basically, the way that I think of it is as soon as I feel the resistance of the fabric, I stop pulling. And that keeps my stitches from distorting the fabric, because if you pull too hard, you're going to start warping the fabric. So you need to be careful with that. So just seat your stitch. And with the laying tool, you just drop it and it falls off that point. Now, some people only use a laying tool on the top stitches, or the top leg of your stitch. I don't want to think that much because I'd just be constantly thinking, oh, do I need to use it or not use it? So I just use a laying tool on everything. So again, you just catch it on the tool, resist a little bit as you're pulling through, and you can clearly see. Let me see which one gives you better contrast. I think the lighter color there. You can see that those two threads are perfectly parallel with each other. So you definitely do get much neater stitches with using a laying tool. So I would highly recommend that you give it a try. You have your the fabric for your project if you're stitching an Aida project with me, once you have it gridded, you have a wide margin there that you could use to practice a laying tool. Now, one of the things about a laying tool is that it's something that you either use it for the entire project or you don't. You can't switch back and forth because it does increase slightly the fullness of your stitches, and so if you switch in the middle of your project, that's potentially going to be visible. So you kind of have to commit. If you decide you're going to use a laying tool, you need to use it for the entire project. So practicing this and before you actually start your project to see if you like it or not is probably a good idea. So to use a trolley needle, I use it on my ring finger. You can use it on any finger you like. These are bendable, so you can just gently bend this to fit your finger. Whichever finger you choose, think about how you touch your face. I touch my face with my index finger and my thumb. I think most people do that. So be careful with using a trolley needle on either of those, because we touch our faces countless times every day without thinking about it, and now you've got a pointy thing on your finger, so be careful that you don't poke yourself in the eye with it. I like the ring finger because it's really easy for me to tuck that finger against my palm and use my needle this way, and this makes it really easy to both stitch and use the laying tool. And so that's why I find using a trolley needle to be a little bit faster than using the pencil style laying tool. But it's the same thing. You just put a little bit of resistance on that thread as you're pulling it through, and you're just gently seating it. Once you feel that the fabric has stopped your stitch, don't jerk on it, just you're done. So don't over tension your stitches. And to give you an idea, this is almost the speed at which I stitch. I can't quite get my head over the top of my stitching like I usually do, so my angle is a little bit off, but you can see that once you get into a rhythm, it goes really quick. You can stitch quite quickly with the addition of using a laying tool. And it's not a whole lot of tension that you're putting on there, so it's not like I'm fighting the thread. I'm just slowing it down a little bit. I'm putting a little bit of a break on it as I pull it through. So that's using a trolley needle. Railroading is another way that you can use to get your stitches to lay parallel to each other. This is not a skill that I do. I have no practice in this whatsoever. I know how to do it, but it's not something I do. But I do want to show you how it works, because a lot of people do this. So as you go down into the fabric, you split your two strands of floss, and so you're basically running your needle in between those two strands as it's coming down. And you can see that it just kind of peels those strands apart so that they lay parallel. I am not good at this, so I'm sure people who do this as their main method are going to be way faster than I am. So all it is just separating those two strands with your needle and going down. Now, I don't see why you couldn't use a laying tool on part of your project and railroad your stitches on another part of the project, because you're getting the same effect with both. So that's something that you could maybe try, is play around with both techniques and see which one you like the best. But this is quite easy to do. I mean, like I said, I never do this, but you can see that I'm kind of, just with a few stitches, I'm getting the hang of it. I think I'm kind of old and set in my ways, so I doubt that I'm going to switch from my laying tool. But this is a good potential way for you to increase your coverage. So that's how you railroad your stitches, and that's how you use a laying tool. The needle parking method that I use, I also combine that with stitching on the diagonal. A lot of people stitch on the diagonal in varying ways. The main reason to do that is to prevent page lines or column lines from forming. So those tend to happen when you're stitching a very large project that has multiple pages of pattern to it. And what ends up happening is if you stitch one page, you stitch up to the edge of your page, which is going to be a column, and all of those stitches are going to be lined up vertically, and there's going to be irregular tension on all the fabric threads within your fabric. And so that over time distorts your fabric. And if you continue stitching on from that line, you're potentially going to be able to see a faint line in your actual stitching. It depends on what the colors are doing in that region of your pattern. It tends to appear more in when there is a few or a single color. You can definitely see those lines, and that's really unfortunate when that occurs. And there's an easy solution, and that's just to simply, instead of stitching up to a vertical line, you stitch up to a diagonal line. When you're stitching up to a diagonal line, that distortion can't happen. The threads in your fabric can't get distorted because you're not putting tension on the same thread all the way down your column. Each diagonal is going to put a bit of tension on a different thread, and so there's not going to be any kind of line that's going to be visible. The other reason I like stitching on the diagonal, besides it helps avoid column lines, is that it's just a cool dynamic way of seeing your pattern appear. Even on small patterns where there is no other page, I always stitch on the diagonal just because I find it just keeps me more interested. There's more variation, the colors change more. I see a little hint of something in the pattern appearing on one diagonal, and then I've got a bit of anticipation to see what that's going to turn out like when I get to the next diagonal. So stitching on the diagonal is very straightforward. It's just as easy as stitching up to a vertical line or two. So I'll show you how that all works also in this little test stitch, and then also in the next video when we actually start stitching. Now, the needle parking method I use, it starts in a corner. Now, I always start in the upper left corner, quite frankly, because I read and write I read left to right, top to bottom. And so it's just instinctual to start in the upper left corner and go in rows from top to bottom. That may or may not be the best choice for you. So I'm going to show you how you can do a test stitch to determine which corner start you prefer, and it's either of any of the four corners, and whether you prefer stitching rows or columns. This will involve a little test stitch, 10 stitches 8 times, so a total of 80 stitches, where you're going to test out all four corners with rows and all four corners with columns. I'll show you how this all works for for 2 of the rows and 2 of the columns, and you'll see the pattern and how this all works, and then you can complete your test stitch. This is a useful activity because if you've never stitched rows or columns, it's a good time to figure out which one works the best for you, which one clicks for your brain, especially if you're a lefty. If you were like me when you were a child and starting to learn to write, I started writing right to left, and I flipped all of my letters. They were mirror images because that tends to be how lefty brains work. Now, if I would have thought about this when I first started stitching in rows, I actually would have considered starting in the upper right corner and stitching right to left, because I do have a very lefty brain. But I just went with what's the convention and what I do in all other aspects of my life, and that's why I start in the upper left corner. And I think I've stitched enough in this manner that I'm not going to change at this point. But if you're new to it, this is a worthwhile activity. It's also a bit of a brain teaser because each one of these test stitches, you have to form your X in a different way. So the way that which is the top leg, and also which hole you come up in for each leg will change for each of these test stitches. The reason for that is because there's two really important rules of cross stitch that I've developed based on my observations of my own stitching that are especially applicable for tapestry style stitching. And those are the third rule, which is that you want to change your thread direction every time you cross the fabric. The reason for that is because that causes the thread to get pulled into its corner of the hole, and so it's going to share that hole with the other three threads that will end up there eventually, and they will share the hole equally, and so you're going to get very consistent regular stitches that way. The fourth rule that is also important in tapestry style stitching is to come up in a less occupied hole. So come up with your needle in a less occupied hole and go down in a more occupied hole. This is a much easier thing to do than the opposite. If you try to come up on a regular basis in more occupied holes, you're going to be splitting threads because there's other threads in that hole already, and it's going to be it can be real tricky to get that stitch to evenly share its space with all of the other surrounding stitches. Often it just becomes either too small or too big. And so that leads to stitch irregularity, and that's what you want to avoid. The more regular you can make your stitches, the more consistent you can make them, the prettier your end result will be, because we're stitching pixels and you want your pixels to be equivalent in size. So you want the only difference between individual stitches to be the color of the stitch, nothing else. So with those two rules in mind, that's why the way that you make the X in this test stitch is different for each corner and for whether it's rows or columns. So let me show you how this all works, and I'll do a few of these and then you can try it for yourself. All right, so I'm going to stitch two corners for rows and two corners for columns. So I'll start with the upper left corner, and I've got this table. There's a PDF of this also in the description box and on my website. So you can see that I show you which leg comes first and the direction of each leg. So for a upper left corner start, stitching rows, you're going to go from bottom left to top right. And coming back, you're going to go bottom right to top left. If you followed Cross Stitch 101 with me when I showed you how to stitch on perforated paper, and I showed you kind of the basics of cross stitch, this is what I had you do there. So as you're stitching, you can notice that every time you cross that fabric, I came down and now I'm going up. And now I'll come down. And now I'm going up with my thread. So every single time I'm crossing the fabric, I'm changing thread direction, and that causes that floss to get pulled into its corner. And so it's basically making it play nice with all the other threads in that hole, and so you get very neat regular stitches. So this is essentially stitching on the diagonal, so I'm showing you that if you start in the upper left corner, this is how your diagonal is going to work. It's basically whichever corner you start in, that's where the right angle of the little triangle to start comes fits. So this is stitching left to right, upper left corner start, stitching rows. So let's take a look at starting in the bottom left corner. So this is where I need to think a little bit. So I need to go down in the upper left and come up in the bottom right. So I'm coming upper left, bottom right. So you'll see here in a second why I'm starting the stitch in the upper hole rather than the lower hole like I did in the previous test stitch. You can see that every time I cross the fabric, I'm getting that nice thread direction change, which is definitely what I want. So you can see that I came up in a less occupied hole. That's why you have to come up in the upper hole as opposed to the bottom hole. You don't want to come up there because there's already a thread there. And it's way easier to come up in an unoccupied hole or a hole that only has one strand of floss in it than one that has 2 or 3. Oh. So here I have to come up in a less occupied hole. It has one strand in it, but it sure beats coming up like here where I have 2 or 3 strands. So there's the bottom left corner, stitching rows. Let's try stitching columns. Let's go in the bottom right corner. And this is always one that kind of challenges me because I need to go with the green leg first and I'm stitching up, which is very odd for me. So going bottom left corner to the upper right, and I'm going up 4 stitches. And then upper left to bottom right for coming back. Now with the needle parking method that I'm going to show you, you have to stitch Danish. So going the round trip stitching. So doing one leg in a section and then crossing that leg coming back on the other section. It doesn't work otherwise. So I'm going green. Going up. And then, this is actually a brain teaser, figuring this out and following a different stitch order every 10 stitches. It's a little bit challenging. So all of this stuff about thread direction change and coming up in less occupied holes, going down in more occupied holes, First person that I ever heard talk about that was Blitz Stitch. He has a detailed video about it, and that's what got me thinking about all of this and really putting my science nerd brain into analyzing what makes a pretty stitch. It's actually kind of a fun little puzzle to think about. Alright, so last corner. I'm going to start in the top right. I'm stitching columns, and I am going to go top left to bottom right, and I'm coming down, stitching down. A lot of people like stitching columns. I see that fairly often, so that's definitely something you should try. If nothing else, try, if you've never stitched rows and columns, try stitching upper left corner, both rows and columns, to see which one you like. I think the vast majority of people choose one or the other of those two, but you know, it doesn't really take that long to do all of them. It's kind of a fun little activity. And this is another place where you can practice using your laying tool also and see if that's something, or you can try railroading also and see if that works for you. So that gives you an idea of how test stitching works. I would recommend that you give it a shot and see what you like, what works for you. I'm going to show you how I use GoodReader to draw diagonal lines on my chart for stitching on the diagonal, and also another feature it has that allows for you to more easily stitch between two pages on a multi-page chart. Both of these features are available in their Pro Pack extension beyond just the basic app. I've taken photographs of my paper charts with my phone, and this is one of them in Photos. And now this needs to get exported into GoodReader, so I'm going to use the Share button and scroll down to copy to GoodReader. Here it is in GoodReader. Now this is a JPEG. I need this to be an PDF, so we're going to use the PDF converter, which is down in the bottom right corner, and it says Convert to PDF, and I'm just going to select that one page, and here it is now converted into a PDF. I'm going to close the JPEG so it's out of the way. The annotations features, the toolbar is on the right side, so here's the line tool. I always just save to the same file because converting the JPEG to another PDF is so easy, and then I don't clog up with a bunch of extra files. So you just tap and then drag in the line connecting the corners of your 10 by 10 grids. You can change the font of it, you can change the opacity, so there's a lot of features you can use, and drawing in the diagonals goes very quickly, and this makes stitching on the diagonal super easy because the diagonal line is just right there on the chart, so I know exactly how far to stitch and I don't have to really think about it. The other main feature I use on GoodReader is the freehand tool, which is what I use to cross off my stitches. It's the only one you can use. You can't use the highlighter tool because this isn't identifiable as like text. It's seeing this as a photograph. So, but the freehand tool works just fine, and you can just cross out your stitches, and again, you can change the font, you can change the opacity. what I do is I stitch in different colors on different days, and this is how I track my progress. So it's a different color every day, and I can see how much I've completed each day. Sometimes I'll put in a date, so you can just put in a date on top of the section that you just stitched. So you can put the date, the number of stitches, and this is where I keep my progress information. I don't keep a separate spreadsheet. I'm too lazy for that. I just throw it into GoodReader. So when you have, one of the issues with stitching on the diagonal is that you will pretty soon, you're going to get to a point where the diagonal line extends between two pages if you have a multi-page pattern. And that gets a little bit tricky for constantly having to switch back and forth between the pages. But the Pro Pack of GoodReader has a split screen feature. So you can set it up so that you have your two sides of your chart. And once you go into the editor, you can see how you can just line up your chart. Obviously, this isn't the correct lineup, but you get the idea. And now you can annotate and stitch between your chart, between pages, and not have to flip between files. So this is really convenient for stitching on the diagonal. So those are the features that I wanted to show you about GoodReader. Again, there's a lot more on GoodReader in my other video, and there's a link directing you straight to that section of that video in the description box below. Here is an example of one of my tapestry style projects. You can see that I'm getting very good coverage. This is stitched on 18 count. I'm not seeing any fabric between each stitch, and I'll zoom in as much as I can and keep it in focus. You can see that I've got very regular stitches, and that most of the threads are laying parallel. I don't get them 100% of the time, but the majority of my threads, the two strands, are laying parallel, and that's what gives really good results. It's not a difficult method to use. I'm not a particularly skilled stitcher. There's nothing all that unique about me. I just have a good method that gives me consistently really good results, and that's something that I can easily share with others. So those are all the things that I wanted to show you in preparation for actually beginning a tapestry style project. Next video, I'll show you the actual process of stitching on the diagonal and using my needle parking method. Please let me know in the description box below which of the things that I've shown you found the most helpful. What are the things that you'd want to try? And if there's any clarification that you'd like on any of the things that I showed, or if you have other ideas or other techniques, I would love to hear your opinions. So please keep the comments coming. I always enjoy hearing what fellow stitchers have to say. Have a good day.